Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you and thank you all for coming. I'm so happy to have all of your faces here in the crowd, as well as the over 50 people attending virtually. My name is Rhea Castronovo, and I am a graduate assistant and student here at the university. In 2017, the School of Public Affairs started a criminal justice event series that includes panel discussions, speaker events, and other forms of dialogue on issues related to criminology, criminal justice, and the law. I would like to take a minute to thank the students, faculty, and staff in the School of Public Affairs for their support and extend a special thank you to the Dean of the School of Public Affairs, Paul Teskey, for his help, to our events coordinator, Emma Martz in the back there, and our marketing director, Tula Wellbrook, for facilitating these events. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge our Student Criminal Justice Honor Society, Alpha Phi Sigma, for their role in putting together these events. And of course, tonight's featured speaker, Elisabeth Epps, for being here. Elisabeth Epps was raised in the American South by an activist mother and has raised her own son in the same tradition. She graduated from the University of Virginia School of Law and has spent decades dedicated to social justice. She is the founder and executive director of the Colorado Freedom Fund and co-lead of the Denver Justice Project, both of which are committed to freedom in the form of pretrial, wealth-based bail reform and ending mass incarceration. In 2018, she led a collaborative effort to host community bailouts for Mother's Day, Father's Day, and Juneteenth. And this action secured freedom for numerous Coloradans and prompted a new initiative to ensure the presumption of innocence to individuals awaiting trial in Colorado. Since 2018, the Colorado Freedom Fund has enabled over 150 people who are being held because of their inability to pay bond to be free. In addition to her work with the Colorado Freedom Fund, Elisabeth serves on the Denver District Attorney's Police Accountability Advisory Committee, and she has worked closely with the Denver Police on their use of force policy rewrite and is currently running for state representative for House District 6. The first part of this event will entail Elisabeth's presentation and a moderated question and answer session. And the last 15 to 20 minutes are reserved for audience questions. So please feel free to ask questions at that time, including people that are attending virtually. All right, thank you again for coming, and please join me in welcoming Elisabeth Epps to CU Denver.
Good evening. I am delighted to be here with y'all tonight. So I'd love to know a little bit more about you before I launch into telling you about me and doing my damnedest in like a half hour to convert a couple of you to abolition. Are you graduate students, faculty? Who's here? Undergrads? Just tell me. This isn't the easy part, y'all. Undergrads, staff, graduate students, alumni. Oh, there you go. Covering the full spectrum here. Well, thank you. How are we tonight? Good. I am Elisabeth Epps, and I am an abolitionist. And in our time tonight, I'd love to accomplish hopefully at least three things. Talk to you about what abolition is to me, what that word means for me. I don't have a monopoly on it, so I'm going to tell you what it means when I use it. Second, I'd like to talk, since given the nature of this series and the criminal justice series, to talk about the difference as I see it between abolition and criminal justice reform. I have some issues with reform in general. And third, since we are here to discuss criminal justice, activism, and action, I'd like to introduce you more to the work of the Freedom Fund. I realize how outdated that bio was. We've gotten over 1,000 of our neighbors free, so much more than 150. So introduce you to the work of the Freedom Fund, talk about what it means in my day-to-day to work as an abolitionist. And that work is in and against, sometimes for a criminal legal system in which freedom is for sale. So you probably know that already. Does that sound achievable? Hopefully in a half hour or so. I respect the moderator's preference for questions at the end, but I'm going to concede to you that I prefer circular conversation to linear. So feel free to like give me visual clues, lean in if you have a question, and we can have this as a conversation. Is anyone here already an abolitionist? Considering? I'll take it. I'll take that 2.5 for real, 3.5. I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask what that means, but that's progress, right? I feel like if I asked that question 10 years ago, people would have thrown fruit and said no. There's not a class actually, as far as I know, but does CU Denver, is there a class in like Abolition 101? Does that exist? Not yet. Well, perhaps they'll let me come teach like a January short course, because I definitely have a syllabus and a plagiarized reading list already prepared that we can work through together. So what is abolition? I believe, I know my friend Carrie does, I believe, and I hope that you all will agree that all of our neighbors deserve to be healthy, safe, and free. That's a starting premise for me. And so as abolitionists, we believe in and we commit to doing the work to provide our neighbors what they need to be healthy, safe, and free. It really, to me, essentially can be that easy. That's what we're talking about. And so abolitionists, right, we do that work of providing the opportunities and the resources to give people what they need to be healthy, safe, and free. And abolition, it truly is, as Professor Ruthie Wilson Gilmore teaches us and has taught us for decades, right, that abolition is about love, it's about creation, it's about building. It's not just about detracting and tearing things down. So it's important. I don't think it's my nerves. I think it actually is warm up here. So I'm going to take my jacket off if that's okay. It's important whenever we venture together, I think, in this work, that we see what values we share, right? What notions we agree upon. Often in our criminal legal spaces, I hear people say, well, no one wants more people in prison. And I think, really? Because we're doing an awful lot of things with our policy decisions that seem pretty focused on getting more people in cages and jails and prisons. It's uncomfortable to talk about, but it's important to recognize that caging humans is a for-profit business. And it's one where states, and here I don't just mean like states like Colorado, but government entities are getting inmate labor, and then there's a profit motive in doing that. So are we sure that no one wants more people in prison? I'm not sure. I tend to think that some people do want more people in prison. So I want to propose, sort of from jump, a principle that I don't think it should be that radical a proposition, but given a venture I've undertaken recently in my personal and professional life running for office, it's been suggested to me that it is a radical proposition. I don't think it is, but I think it does have radical implications, y'all. But I want us to agree as a value judgment, as a value statement, that human beings do not belong in cages. Just period. Full stop. And I want to be transparent that for me, there are no exceptions to that. As an aspirational goal, as something we're working towards, I hope we can want a world where humans aren't in cages. And I invite you, if when I say that, maybe it's not the case, but if when I say that people do not belong in cages, if in your mind, if you're a normal human being, right, if your mind naturally jumps to, but what about, right? But what about the murderers? Or what about the group I'm really scared of? Or what about the people who've committed an act that I find really scary? That part of the invitation here, y'all, is to set that aside for a moment if you can, and ask me later if you want my take. During Q&A, ask me if I think that even cops who kill unarmed people should not die in prison, and we can talk about that further. But just for the thought experiment to see how much common ground we have, want to come back to that principle that human beings do not belong in cages. They didn't belong in cages in 1619. Humans didn't belong in shackles and cages in 1880, not now and not ever. Is anybody there yet? Because I don't even completely agree with me, but does anybody agree that humans shouldn't be in cages? Good. That's encouraging, because you all are the folks who are going to be making the policy decisions moving forward, so that feels really good. This matters to me. This idea of, do we agree that humans don't belong in cages? And it matters to me that we lean into the tension of what the implications of that are, right? All the humans deserving to be not in cages. It matters because when we're making a case, even a hurried sort of half-hour case for abolition, we need a fundamental shared principle to understand why, in a world where freedom is for sale, as it is in these United States, the case for abolition is necessarily, y'all, it's by definition, it's distinct and mutually exclusive from a case for reform. Grad school for me was complicated. Backing up to tell you how I came to be an abolitionist, right? How I came to be it, what it means to me, the distinction between reform and then the Freedom Fund. grad school was complicated. Academic work was okay. I did well enough. I went somewhere where our grad assistants and professors made sure we all did fine. I mean that lovingly, but they really did. Like you couldn't fail, I think. But while grad school and law school were complicated, it was tougher for me than it was for many of my classmates. I was a single mom to a little boy who was a middle schooler through grad school and law school. I had him when I was 16, so I became a parent very young. And when I started law school, my 91-year-old grandmother lived with me. I was her primary caretaker. This was a lot to be taking on as a law student, right? Raising a child, being the caretaker for a 91-year-old. I was also working full-time. I was Kaplan's Teacher of the Year 2 years in a row. I worked nights and weekends teaching the LSAT because that aforementioned little boy liked to eat 3 or 4 times a day, every day. And in my spare time in the fall of 2008, when I started law school, I was working to elect President Obama. I had a lot on my plate. But those weren't even the things that made law school and my graduate school experience. I was working on a graduate program at the same time hard. What made it hard, particularly hard, and I promise this connects to my route to abolition, is that in the summer between my first and second year of law school, that's where it got really difficult. So you're supposed to be okay if you get through first year. And in between my first and second years, I was already interested, I should say, in indigent defense. You know what I mean by that? Representing poor people as a public defender, trying to keep poor folks out of cages. I was interested in it, but I also was really interested in maybe taking a 6-figure firm job and finally like not being in poverty for the first time in my life. But then one Wednesday night in July, after my first year of law school, after a John Legend concert of all things, I went to jail. I was arrested and taken to jail, and it shook me, and it set me in a very direct route on my path to abolition. So July of 2009, with me in the holding cell my first night was another Black woman. She was actually just about my age, and she had a son about the same age as mine. I was told that I was being charged with felony assault on a peace officer, peace in quotes, public intoxication, trespass. Does anybody know, if I ask law students, they always know the answer to this, but y'all might too. What else was I charged with? What do they always throw in? You look like a cop to me. Are you a cop? Okay, gotcha. You know some cops. What do they always throw in, y'all? I hope if you don't know, anyone know? They always throw in resisting arrest for good measure, right? Whether you resist always might be a slight hyperbole, but not really. Resisting arrest. So let's take those in reverse order. I probably resisted the arrest. I'll claim that one. I did not trespass. I was in my own car in a place that I was legally permitted to be. Public intoxication, I was not drunk. I'd intended to get drunk, but the night didn't go as I'd planned. I hadn't had anything to drink. And as one of the police officers said of me, a direct quote, "She's not drunk, she's just a bitch." So awkward thing for a cop to say on camera, but it was exonerating, right? In terms of the charge of public intoxication. And lastly, I did not assault the cop, the main charge, but I was really mouthy. Turns out it wasn't going to be the last time in my life that I was arrested for talking back to a cop. You might not find it directly in your statute book, but I assure you in Virginia, also here in Colorado, as I learned the hard way, being Black and talking back to a cop is most definitely against the law. So I'm in a cage. And keep in mind, I've told you some about my background, but I became a parent at 16. I'd gone to 12 schools in 10 years. I'd skipped a grade. I graduated early. My mother had died when I was 9. My father had gone to prison. And yet somehow here I was at this top 10 law school. I checked the boxes, right? I made it out. And then here I was in a jail cell up the street from my top 10 law school. I don't remember if I ate or if I slept that night. I was terrified and I was furious. I was livid. I don't know if I thought of myself yet as an abolitionist. If I did, it was a very narrow version of abolition. I wanted to abolish this cage, right? I wanted me out of this cage is what I was focused on. I'm not sure how evolved my, sort of political analysis was. I was upset about my rights. Fast forward many years later, I would get vindicated in front of a federal jury having to do with my constitutional rights, but that's another story. I was so upset, and I was particularly upset because here I was, a law student, wondering where, this is embarrassing to say out loud, but like, didn't I get to call a lawyer? Where were my Miranda rights? No one had read me my rights. Like, despite having at law school, I was falling back on Law and Order and TV and thinking what rights I had. None of these were actual in practice rights. Never mind what our professors had taught us in criminal law and criminal procedure. As I promise you, I hope you don't know this from firsthand experience, but I promise you, all of that book learning goes out the window when you're in a cage in a tiny Southern jail cell. And as my cellmate, this young woman who was about my age, she explained to me, despite my respectable grade in crim law, some of you are studying criminal justice, criminal law, I had a right to a lawyer. You all know this, right? But that right to contact a lawyer, this right you hear about on TV, like to a phone call, do you know that that's not a thing? Like the phone call is just attached to contacting your lawyer if you're being interrogated. There's no right to a phone call. Maybe everyone here knew this. I did not. I did not understand this in this moment. And so this young woman who was my age is explaining this to me and is calming me down. And I'd invite you to consider, right, how hard that was. So here I am, I've made it part of the way. When I say made it, I mean like you have the weight of your family on your back, right? Not going to ask you to identify yourself, but maybe some of you are first generation college, or if not first generation to attend, you might be first generation to finish, right? Some of us had parents who put a step in or a foot in. And now it was all going to be over because I was arrested for assaulting this cop. You've heard the phrase there, but for the grace of God, go I. So the cellmate and I, we were the same age, as I've mentioned, mothers of boys the same age. And in a few weeks, I was going to go back to my fancy law school and I was going to be okay. And as I learned later, she wasn't okay. Our paths took different directions that night and she wasn't okay. But of the two of us, she understood how the Fifth and Sixth Amendments work in practice. I don't know, maybe she was an abolitionist. I didn't get to ask her. But things turned out better for me than they did for her. A month after the arrest, y'all, I had to interview on campus. Second year of law school, you interview for jobs, right, that you'll have in the future. I'm headed into interviews with these big firms, and Google was already Google back then. And it's taken about 12 years, but now if you Google me, you have to go a couple pages back to find the time I allegedly spit on the cop in Charlottesville. It's still there. But at this point, I mean, imagine going into job interviews and knowing that when they Google you, all the things you've done, the debate tournaments you've won, your kids in upstate, all the good things you've done. And it's just a mugshot. And it's that I was accused of, they never follow up and say what you were acquitted of, right? Or what charges were dismissed. It's just this mugshot and accused of assaulting this cop. And it changed a lot of things for me because here I was so literate, so well-resourced. So, and by well-resourced, I mean in terms of I'm at this school with these professors, there's like-minded people, I have access to other, I don't just mean financial resources, but ideas and ways out and thought partners. And I was struggling to navigate this and it was really heavy on my heart. How must this be for our folks in community who don't have that same level of access, right? It was summer, so there wasn't class to show up for, but like when I didn't come home, people were looking for me, right? People were looking for me to be posting or to be showing up, or, there was someone looking and knowing that something had to be wrong. That added challenge of knowing that every potential employer was going to see that first thing was tough. I will tell you, spoiler alert, so you're still in school, I may gotten a C or something, I don't know what is a bad grade even, or a scary grade, it's going to be okay. Right? So 10 years after allegedly spitting on that cop, I didn't, by the way, I was talking like this. It was very animated. This is what I was just, spoiler alert, like I didn't even, I lost whatever street cred I would have had. I didn't even do anything to the cop. I just yelled at him and cussed at him and was very animated. 10 years later, like it's okay. So I don't know, I'm looking at you like you've got a bad grade once, I'm sorry, but like whatever that thing is, there's light on the other side of it. And the abolitionist lens that I came to work through helped me get there. I definitely thought my life was over that night in that jail cell, but it wasn't. I did, however, decide to drop out of law school very unceremoniously and marched into my dean's office, and told him all about his backwoods racist law school And he heard me out and was like, "You are not dropping out of law school, Miss Epps," and talked me down off the ledge. So shout out to good staff and faculty who have no doubt talked a student or two off the ledge themselves. That same dean and I were then later sitting right by each other. I became kind of, I think, a pet project for him. When the Angela Davis, you've heard of her, right? Of course you have. She came and spoke at the University of Virginia. And right, so my dean is exactly the demographic that you would expect of the dean of the University of Virginia Law School. That's changed now. Now it's a woman, but he's an older white gentleman, and I was me. And we're sitting next to each other, listening to Angela Davis. She's probably one of, if not one of the most well-known prison abolitionists. And a student who was there at the talk asked her a question, said something like, when you say prison abolition, you're not actually saying open the gates of the prison and let everyone out, right? And she said, yes, that is what I mean. And I'm sitting next to my dean and I burst into applause and I'm like, yeah. And I'm like sort of processing like, wait, no, do I even think that? I don't know if I even think that. My dean did not think that in that moment, but that was okay. I didn't think then, 2009 or so, that she was being literal. I should check myself in that, because far be it from me to think that this grown woman who's published and written and lectured and traveled didn't mean exactly what she said to us. But I didn't think that's what she meant at the time. I thought, we're not actually trying to open the gates and let the bad guys out, right? A decade later, I think she might have meant it more literally than I understood at the time. When I tell you that I'm an abolitionist, I think there's a long list of things we should abolish, right? First on the list is poverty, but then there's also, right, I think we should abolish the institution of marriage, voter registration, borders, the electoral college. I have, 40 years left on this earth to get going on some of these. I think we should abolish time zones and the death penalty. We handled that here in Colorado. But the abolition that in this last portion of our time together that I want you to join me in considering is that which Angela Davis does teach us about. The abolition of, in fact, that prison industrial complex. The system that would make it that no matter how mouthy I was, you don't know me that well, a couple of you do, but like, consider that I was really mouthy. I didn't call him out of his name, but I was pretty intense with my word choice. But do we want a system where no matter what I'd said, that there's any room for me to be taken to a cage for it? Like, is that a good use of our collective resources? And I was naive enough then, even at this fancy law school, to not know how often that happens. And how often it's Black and brown folks and Indigenous folks who have the nerve, the entire gall to talk back, just talk back, not talk back and kick, not talk back and fight, not talk back and threaten, just talk back at a protest and be maced in your face by a Denver police officer, right? Or talk back as I did at a protest and get tear gassed and shot with pepper balls. The question, the abolitionist invitation is to ask, is that a good use of resources? Is that a good use of giving people what they need to be healthy, safe, and free? It can't be, right? Those are policy choices and they're disastrous ones. When I mention this invitation to think about the difference between abolition and reform, I have a real relationship with the word reform. Like, I'm learning a lot from the scholars and the younger students who are doing, those aren't separate groups, from the scholars and students and researchers who are working on reform and who are inviting us to consider that there's abolitionist reforms and there's reformist reforms. Are you familiar with this distinction at all? Where a reform just being a change to the system, an abolitionist reform is one that results in a net increase in liberation, right? Is it a change that gets more people free? Versus, is it a reform that just gives us kinder, gentler cages? And a whole lot of people in my political party and who I align with on many things, what they really want are kinder, gentler prisons. They want bigger windows in the doors of solitary confinement. This is a thing, right? Now, for someone who's in solitary confinement tonight, right, if research tells us that their mental health is better if there's a bigger window, of course I want that tonight, but I don't want us investing in that. I want them out of solitary confinement. right? So the reformist reform says give a person in a cage more for-profit phone call time with their loved one. And abolitionist reform says send them home to their loved one, right? So we can do one in the service of advancing the others. This difference between abolition and reform, or abolitionist reforms, there's amazing civil rights lawyers here. Some who went to school here and then went to law school in Colorado who are winning and suing the Department of Corrections, suing police departments for millions of dollars, and it's vital work. It's vital work because we get changes in these lawsuits, right? Things like making sure that people for whom beards are a part of their religious tradition should not be made to shave. That's important, but we should also be working towards those people shouldn't be in the cage, right? Folks should be housed with people of their, for safety reasons, we know it's important that people are housed with folks who match their gender identity, but it's also really important that we just move them out of the cages, especially given how often those folks are in prisons for committing acts that were acts of survival in the first place. I hope that makes some sense. Lawsuits work, but they have a limited value, right? They have to be one of several tools. We have to be doing litigation, legislation, and direct action to move from just reform to abolition. When we speak of abolition, I think that it's natural to think of tearing things down because it's right there in the word, burning it to the ground. And I think that has its place. I'll confess to you that when I'm using the word abolition, had I known, by the way, had I known 2 years ago that I was going to run for office, I would not have used this word so much because I just would not have. I get that it scares people, but it's okay. We can have this conversation. But many of us consciously use the word as a nod to the particularly Black and brown feminist scholars and queer scholars who for decades have charged us to use the term because they're using it as a direct extension of the work of folks who work to abolish chattel slavery, right? That was their term, and they bring that through to the work today. So even though it's right there in the word, talking about tearing things down, and you've seen this, I mean, some of us have lived long to see the actual tearing down, right? In East Germany, or what was East Germany, in Los Angeles and in Ferguson, in Hong Kong, in Puerto Rico, sometimes things have to burn, systems have to burn, physical walls have to burn, but abolition is about more than that. It's ultimately about that which we build together. Does anyone follow prison culture on Twitter, Miriam Kaba? You should. There's your only have two pieces of homework. One is if you have Twitter, follow, it's at prison culture. Oh, she might be private again. Her name is Miriam Kaba, and if you're allowed to have a favorite abolitionist, she's mine. She teaches us so well that about how as abolitionists, we work not just to dismantle, though that too, but to build, and that we work to build safe and healthy and whole self-sufficient communities. Because what we know, y'all, you know this, and you know this in your work as scholars, you know this in your work as community members, that when we're talking about abolishing the prison industrial complex and we're talking about a world without policing, that world already exists for many of our neighborhoods. Many of our neighborhoods already have that. They don't see a police officer in the course of their day. That's not a, unless they seek one out, right? But police aren't patrolling their neighborhoods. When their high school child has an injury skiing and has the misfortune of becoming dependent on an opioid, their child in that situation is appropriately treated with love and care, is seen as a medical condition, right? They're often offered therapy and rehab, versus in other communities, if your child becomes dependent on a substance, they're tossed in a jail cell, right? So the world that we're wanting, the abolitionist approach, right? I'm using that as a specific thing, harm reduction and substance use, that already exists. So the thing that we're asking for, it's not imaginary, it's just imaginary for some of us. So we know when we think about abolition that communities who have good schools, who have places for rest and relaxation and play, communities that have clean water and clean air, it shouldn't be surprising that those are the communities that need the least policing, right? Because these are examples of when we give people what they need to be healthy and safe and free, people in general do a pretty good job of taking care of that, right? When we give them the opportunities and the resources to meet these needs, they can do that. I was at a convening a while ago, trying to think how I can anonymously tell this anecdote, but I was at a small gathering, and everyone there were legal workers. So some lawyers, but most folks were actually not lawyers. So some were paralegals, others were, there's places in the country, I'll probably know this, where you don't actually have to be licensed as an attorney to assist with a lot of legal work, protecting folks from evictions, things like this. I hope we'll move towards that in Colorado, but I was at this convening and people were doing their report backs on kind of who you've helped in the past year and how many people you've helped get free. And I don't remember what our number to report was at the Freedom Fund, number of people we've gotten out, but this one person shared that in the past year, they've gotten one person free, just one. And I was thinking to myself, that's awesome, right? Systems are very different. Bail bond works differently in different places. And I was sort of mentally preparing to congratulate them because I misinterpreted that they were saying it as if it was, oh, it was only one they got free. And then this person proceeded to describe how the one person they got free had a complicated immigration status and was at a halfway house. And they basically de-arrested this person and got them to safety in a country that welcomed them. This was their getting of someone free. So I sort of like had to was like, I am not working hard enough. Like I am not getting people to Canada, to the embassy. That's abolition too, right? There's a Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, John Brown, Quakers along the Underground Railroad. There's that level of putting your body on the line, right? Particularly if you are a white presenting person, putting your family's safety on the line in the service of helping Black and brown folks get free. God bless those who can do that. And there's some of us who work within the system and can run bail funds. I'm in the latter group. But that's abolition too. If you're not quite prepared to put your law license or your family's freedom on the line as these folks did, we still need you in the work of abolition. Revisiting that distinction as we'll then talk about the Freedom Fund, and then it's probably time to move to questions. All right. So I'm just proud I didn't cry when I thought about being in jail in Charlottesville, but definitionally again, y'all, so reform and reformist reforms, reformist reforms. Remember that they shift, or sometimes they sometimes they sanitize state violence is really what they do. And here I want to be clear that I'm talking about, when I'm talking about abolitionist reforms, I'm talking about something that I think is distinct from incrementalism. But keep in mind that if you're going to work through a lens of abolition, you always want to be pushing towards more freedom or more people free. And this is why a tension, right, that I have when people will point out that folks who are accused of white collar crimes, well, they don't go to prison, and advocating for certain folks to certain economic crimes, right, wage theft and things like that, advocating for those folks to go to prison. Well, I hear you, but if you're advocating for that, you just want different people in a cage. I want less people in a cage, right? I don't get more freedom by putting white collar criminals in a cage. I have some ideas for how we can stop them from committing harm, but the idea is, right, that as an abolitionist, the reform that I want is one that gets more people free, not that just puts different people in. I think there's a lot of America who should be glad that what Black and brown folks are asking for isn't vengeance, right? That's not what we're asking for. We're not asking for payback. Many of us are not asking for that. A couple other examples of that. So ending cash bail, talking about the Freedom Fund. Ending cash bail on its own, I made a big assumption there. So because we're here and y'all are educated folks. So cash bail is what you pay in Colorado to get someone who is pretrial, who's been charged with a crime, who hasn't had that proverbial day in court. They haven't been convicted. The state sets a bounty or a ransom, a price. It's literally a price. So if you pay $50, if you pay $5,000, you can get out. Cash bail is the process of paying that amount and getting the person out. I oppose that. I think it is fundamentally unjust that if you and I, so I'm gonna stop picking on you. So if you and I are accused of the same offense, the same DUI, there's no physical injury, no harm to other people's property. It's our first arrest for both of us. The same situation, and the judge puts $1,000 bond on, on both of our cases. You don't have it, I do. I get to go home and they don't. That has nothing to do with community safety. I'm not more safe than you. You're not more risky than me. You're just more poor. That's literally the difference. That is fundamentally unfair, and we are working to end that at the Colorado Freedom Fund. But ending cash bail on its own, just on its own, that's a reformist reform, because the system is quick and pliable and flexible. And they'll replace it with, well, let's put everybody on a for-profit ankle monitor, right? Let's track the whereabouts, right? In this situation we have, maybe both of us should not be driving a vehicle for a minute while we work things out. But do we need to know where she is? No, I don't think so, right? But the system will say, okay, we'll let you out and we'll put an ankle monitor on you in a for-profit expense. So it's the ending pretrial detention in all of its forms. That's the abolitionist reform. I hope that distinction makes some sense, right? So you'll hear folks talk a lot about ending cash bail, but it's not enough on its own. Carceral options. It's your work, it's our work to push back on all of those things. When I say carceral options, I mean electronic incarceration, ankle shackles, constant surveillance. We already all sign up to like be surveilled by having this with us most of the time, but it's a whole nother thing to agree to have, you know, an ankle shackle on someone. In 2018, any of you remember SB 10? It was like forever ago, but good. So that was an earnest nod. You know, so there was a proposal in California, I guess it passed actually. It really was terrifying legislation. So it went into effect in 2019. It ended cash bail, and that's what the headlines said. And I love my friends and family who like associate me with bail. They were sending me all the articles and were like, yay, we ended bail. And I was like, I don't know how to kill their joy and tell them this is terrible. This is very bad. But it was terrible. It was very bad. And there's a lot of centrist folks. I don't mean this in a pejorative way, but there's a lot of centrists, I don't know what else to call them, in Colorado who would have us end cash bail in the same way. And the problem with this, heads up for when the proposal comes around, is that it ended cash bail, but it didn't set a timeline on when you got to go before a judge. So in our work at the Freedom Fund, what we literally do is we pay ransom across the state, all across this beautiful state, to get our folks out of jail. I've been to Weld and Larimer and Mesa and Pueblo. It's a lovely drive, but getting our folks out of cages. Now, if someone has $100 bond, surely you know, without me telling you anything else about their situation, if they have $100 bail, I'm using these terms interchangeably, the distinction doesn't really matter here. But if the judge said $100 bail, how dangerous is this person? This person is not that dangerous, okay? This person, whatever, I don't know what $100, I wish I could have heard what you said. Like whatever $100 dangerous is, it's not that dangerous. No judge is putting her career on the line, right, by assigning $100 bail to somebody she sees as dangerous. What they are is really, really poor, okay? I've lived in my car. I've experienced homelessness. It has been tough. And yet there has never been a point in even the toughest points in my life I couldn't have figured out a way to scrape together 100 from 10 of y'all. I mean, it would have been tough, right? But $100 poor. So in thinking about ending cash bail and how I'm connecting this to the abolitionist reform is, as offended as I am to pay $100 to get my neighbor out of a cage, I'd rather pay $100 than have them have no bail and just wait indefinitely to see a judge, right? So if you just end cash bail without setting a time limit on when you see a judge, what happens is that folks literally sit days and weeks. And so somebody tell me what happens if you're charged with a low-level offense and you're waiting 30, 45 days for your day in court. And at your first court date, it's not going to be your trial. Your first court date, you can pay $100 if you have it. You can plead guilty or you can wait the next 90 days for trial. You don't have $100. What do? You plead guilty every time. Every once in a while, I'll meet a wonderful, stubborn, adorable knucklehead who's been in forever, right? And you want to be like, why didn't you? I mean, you can't say why, but who will just say, I've done A, B, C, and D, Miss Epps, but I didn't do E and I'm not pleading guilty. But in terms of a societal resource, imagine just bullying folks, which is what we're doing with cash bail and those pleas. So the abolitionist reform that we want is one that ends the cash bail without replacing it with the carceral option, which gives people a path out. I'm wrapping up this thought about abolition-focused reform and connecting this back to the original, or in modern history, our original use of this term. So I went to the University of Virginia. No one's ever been able to tell me whether this was on purpose in a ha-ha way or on purpose in an honoring way, but our Office of African American Studies was physically on the foundation that was the slave quarters. And like, I never knew quite how to feel. Like maybe it was a beautiful thing, right? Maybe it was a sign of real progress, is that here we were, Black students in this space, but it also felt kind of like, really, y'all, as big as this campus is, this is the spot y'all give us. But during chattel slavery at Mr. Jefferson's University, there were slave owners in the American South, and Thomas Jefferson was one of them, who owned people, who sexually assaulted people, but he vocally, until his death, advocated for what he called gradual emancipation. Gradual, right? He was going to own people, but one day down the line, maybe it would be okay for folks to be free. And he preached, he wrote in his papers that people who owned other people should ameliorate slavery's most violent features, literally kinder, gentler slavery. There's something to that. He's saying you can own people, but you shouldn't rape them. You should keep families together whenever possible. You should minimize the physical abuse of your men. This was an argument that resonated with a scary amount of our neighbors, right? Or our neighbors' ancestors, right? And it's not that different than saying, you know, we should make sure that folks have running water in prisons. Well, yes. But no, it should be we all have clean water, and we save those limited carceral spaces for the folks where we have no other way to take good care of them. Solitary confinement is another example. Solitary confinement is an example, y'all, where the system has thrown up our hands. And it said, we're willing to just give this person up and let them just descend into darkness because we're not going to take good care of them. We can be better than that. We can find another way to take care of our folks. I told you a bit about what we did at the Freedom Fund, that we've gotten over 1,000 of our neighbors out of jail. We've never applied for a grant, and we've spent over, it's now $2.2 million in small donations from community members to get folks out of jail. And it's a revolving bail fund. So to be clear, when folks resolve their cases, however they resolve them, amazingly, when they're out of jail, a lot of cases get dismissed. You've seen this. When you can't bully someone into a plea, folks get real upright, like their posture changes when they come back to court, not in shackles. All of a sudden, they're ready to fight it. They're ready to fight their case, right? But however their case is resolved, when it is resolved, we get the money back. And so that's how we've been able to spend so much more money than we ever raised, is because we keep getting the money back in that way. So our name, the Colorado Freedom Fund, it's a very intentional name. There are organizations that we've learned from who have named themselves, or their name includes the word bond. So they're a location and it's the bail fund or the bond fund. We made a very intentional choice to name ourselves the Colorado Freedom Fund because it's an abolitionist value also to recognize the power of language, right? And to name that which we want, not that which we want less of, right? So we want more freedom, and that's why we named ourselves that way. And we do this direct action work. We couple it with litigation and legislation to work to get ourselves free. That's the work of abolition in a longish nutshell. And it's a work of the Freedom Fund. And I hope it isn't too radical, this proposition that we started with, even if it does have radical implications, the one that human beings don't belong in cages. So before I invite your questions, and I'd love to, I guess I've got one of my own, is anyone willing to at least consider working through an abolitionist lens, even if you aren't all the way there like our friend from Jeffco yet? Yes? Okay, this table is down. Thank y'all, I appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was lovely. I know I'm burning with questions, but I don't want to steal the mic from anybody. So does anyone here have any questions?
The question was, how long was I in jail? Is that what you said? I've never stopped and added it up. So in 2015, I was the last and hopefully last ever time that I was arrested for talking back to a cop. Actually, Carrie knows this. Sorry to keep picking on you, but you do know this. You can see well, I don't know if you can see it from there, but there's scars on the top of my feet. And the scars on the top of my feet, kind of see one of them, are from an officer named Matthew Green, who arrested me for talking back to him in 2015 and dragged me when I fainted. 4 years later, he sat on the legs of Elijah McClain and helped kill him. And for talking back to Matthew Green, I was sentenced to 30 to 90 days in jail. I had to serve 27 in 2019 because I appealed it all the way to the state Supreme Court. I promise you, if they sentenced me to 10 days jail, I'd have done my 10 days, talk a whole lot of smack, but done it. But 90 days? I'd been a public defender who represented people who committed sex assault who didn't get 90 days jail. So that was the longest time, and it was a work release sentence. And so with good time, the total amount of the sentence was 27. And I'll say that one thing about that experience is I mentioned the ankle shackles. Even though I was in jail, because I had work release, I had this ankle monitor. It's one of the most ridiculous things we do. Having an ankle monitor on me when I'm in jail, you know where I am. Like I can laugh now because it's that ridiculous. But at the time, I had to sleep with my ankle hanging off the bed because you have this, monitor on. And it was weeks after being out of jail that I was able to train my body to stop hanging my leg off my own bed at home. And I would often think about how if my body gets trained that way, right, that even after the monitor's off, that I'm used to sleeping this way. Imagine what we're doing to our neighbors psychologically and to their mental health if there's this physical stain.
Thank you.
We have some questions from our virtual audience.
Oh, I didn't know there was a virtual. Or I forgot.
Yeah, well, this question is from Micah. How would abolition provide accountability to people with privilege who commit crimes, white-collar criminals, hate crimes against marginalized people, January 6th insurrectionists, etc.?
So that's a great question. Accountability is an interesting word. The sort of accountability I'm most interested in is the accountability that prevents that harm from happening again. So when we're providing people what they need, what were the examples? It was January 6th. Tell me the first two.
White-collar criminals, hate crimes against marginalized people.
Yeah, so I'll take those three separately because I sort of imagine them being dealt with in very different ways. White-collar crime, one of the ones that I'm most concerned about is wage theft, right? A lot of folks in my world care a whole lot when a poor woman allegedly takes diapers from a Target. This happens a lot, or takes Tide from a Target, but isn't willing to talk about how the workers at these stores aren't getting paid overtime, or how their wages are suppressed, or how they're being forced to tip, and just other ways of wage theft. I think that the appropriate sanctions there are economic ones for the people who are in the positions of making that decision. I think that when we force a living wage, not just a minimum or even living, but a thriving wage, we eliminate the possibility of wage theft in these ways, right? I don't understand how anyone can get by in Denver making less than $31 or $32 an hour, which is what I think the minimum thriving wage should be closer to. So the abolitionist way of approaching it is stopping the wage theft before it happens. On the other end, I do deeply have to be careful because I'm running for office, but I do believe in taxing wealth and assets as opposed to just income. And so I want to meet those people where they are in terms of the harm they're committing. Hate crimes is complicated for me because I do not believe as a principle that we should legislate or regulate thought. I think that the action matters more than often the motivation, and it gets really difficult with hate crimes, the element that relates to inciting terror. So I think this is a situation that we really have to look at independently. And I think what matters is the access that people committing the hate crime have. So here, ever since the 2012, 2013 recalls of Democratic lawmakers, in my assessment, certain folks have been really cautious about willing to be bold on gun bills, right? When we think about a situation where there was a day several years ago, I'm not going to name the places, but some of you will know them. There was a day where there was an attack on a children's school in America where children were slaughtered with a firearm. And the same day, there was an attack on children in another part of the world, elementary school, where many people didn't hear about it because the person didn't have access to a gun, and so the injuries were minimal. So as offensive as the hate and the underlying motivation is, that's a situation where I'm more concerned in stopping the access to the weapon. Because the degree to which I'm harmed is mitigated. It doesn't matter what you think about me if you don't have access to a resource to harm me. Does that make some sense? January 6th, we don't have enough time. Elect better people, I guess is my short answer. Elect better people. It's complicated. It's complicated.
Great, thank you. And then we have one more from Ian. He says, hi, Elizabeth. I am still a very novice abolitionist in that I don't fully understand the nuances and theories. One thing that I feel I'm asked often is, so you want murderers to roam the streets? I realize this is meant to be extreme, but how do you eloquently answer that? How do abolitionist scholars and experts balance public safety with the inhumane act that is imprisonment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wouldn't trust my neighbors if folks weren't asking that question. So no, of course we don't want murderers. It's not about murderers roaming, but it's really the thing we don't want is murder. So there's a couple invitations here. When we say we don't think people should be in cages and people say, what about murder? The first invitation is to consider, like, I need y'all to know that's not who the Denver jail is full of. Okay. The Denver jail is full of poor people, many of whom use substance, many of whom are struggling with mental health addictions, many of whom are suffering from a toxic drug supply, many of whom have not been able to maintain housing. They are not people accused of murder. So thinking about the space we're in and like public policy and public affairs, one of the suggestions is let's not build public policy around the outlier. So since the jails aren't full of people, prisons, but here we're talking about jails, like since they're not full of people who committed murder, as important as the question is, it's also important that we don't build a whole system around the outlier. Does that make sense? The next invitation is to consider, how do people wind up charged with, or not charged with, right? The death has happened. How do people wind up committing this level of harm? There are entire groups of people charged with murder who I think should be let out Monday. People who have made a choice in domestic violence situations to save their own life. I think those are people who shouldn't be in a cage. We are in a nation where there are states who are criminalizing reproductive justice acts as murder. Those are entire categories of people who shouldn't be in. When you have communities that are struggling with scarce resources, right? Drug wars and gang wars, I'm using the hyperbolic language of cable news, those are manufactured situations that are public policy choices. 19-year-olds who commit those acts of harm are not the people that they are when they're 29 or 39. And so the amount of time that we're leaving people in these cages needs to be revisited. So no, of course, the thing is that it's not about wanting murderers out, it's about wanting to interrupt that which causes murder. Situations that alleviate and interrupt domestic violence would alleviate an awful lot of homicide. And I also just want to add to that, as gently as I can, that in my world, maybe not all, but certainly most of the women I know who identify as abolitionists, we come to this work because cops and courts and cages didn't keep us safe. That already didn't happen. Okay, we've already got a dead parent. We've already survived an attempt on our life. We've already been the victims of brutal domestic violence. And we already saw how the system as it's set up didn't keep us safe. So as we're being courageous about navigating what's next, we're acknowledging that the people who've created these systems aren't going to be the ones to fix them. And it's okay to acknowledge that parts of it are really hard and that some folks, unfortunately, are going to have to sit tight while we work out the details. But since the jails aren't full of people who've committed murder, let's start with the folks who are actually making up, who are actually filling the jails. Yes.
Thank you. I think you did a great job dissecting how to approach the for-profit prison system and why we need to abolish that. Do you have any solution ideas towards the enablers of that, meaning demagoguery, fear-mongering, and political motivations for saying, you know, the war on drugs or immigrants are taking your jobs and blah, blah, blah. Is abolition going to solve that, or what can we do in that regard?
So there's a lot there. One of the invitations, I keep using that word, but is if you're not familiar with it, didn't look like a lot of you are familiar with Mariam Kaba, but I really encourage you to check out the website transformharm.org. Almost all of the what ifs you can think of have been addressed in essays there. And I love it as a resource because a lot of folks think we're just coming up with stuff on the fly. And it's like, no, people have been writing about this stuff for decades and thinking it through. Thing about for-profit prisons, and I mention them because of course I do object to the profit motive. And profit motive shouldn't, there's a list of things. Why do we have the profit motive in K-12 education? Why is there a profit motive in healthcare? Like there are things that, I guess that's a whole other issue, but public safety shouldn't have that for-profit motive. But I think it's important to acknowledge that it's single digit. The amount of people who are in American cages in America who are in a for-profit cage, it's single digit, y'all. Most folks are like, so less than 10%. Most folks who are in I don't want to say an American cage, but who are in a cage in America are in one that is state run in some way. So sometimes I fear that even our own references to for-profit can be a bit of a red herring. I saw a congressman from Arapahoe recently tweet, there should be no for-profit immigration cages. We were like, or he didn't say cage. He said immigration prisons. You saw there's no for-profit immigration prison. We're like, oh, Representative Crow, so close, so close, so close. Like there should just be no immigration prisons at all. So acknowledging that it's a red herring. The abolitionist lens, remember at its core though, we're just talking about giving people what they need to be safe, healthy, and free. Not going to touch on what you said about demagoguery, although you get a private nod from me about it. But in the case of, you gave the example of immigration prison and this suggestion that immigrants are taking our jobs or whatever else, right? It's a particularly, I don't have a good word for it. It's wild to be in this land where folks are so good about doing their land acknowledgements, right? We start our meetings by recognizing that we are on the unceded land of the Arapahoe and the Cheyenne and Ute, but we don't want to talk about land back. And we want to demand papers for brown folks to be in this land. Like I've been here over a decade and it still just astounds me that in this space, of all space, that we would be so hostile. Migration is a human right, and immigration should be seen as a human right as well. The abolitionist lens of how we push back on that, one is you ask these questions in your spaces, not just here, right? Is you stand with your immigrant neighbors. You push back on, I'm old enough, we're saying now abolish ICE, but I grew up with abolish the INS, right? It doesn't have to exist. ICE is this new thing. It's not even our lifetimes old. So we push back on this ways and we remember that the abolitionist commitment to it is thinking about what people need to be safe, healthy, and free. Insert a whole lecture, right, about the terror that has happened in our government's name in Central and South America that would help lend themselves to conditions where people would brave the things they brave to come north in search of a better life, right? It's just an interesting phenomenon to be hands off once people get here, as if we didn't have a hand in the situations that led them to want to be here. And we'll have to talk about that offline, because I think I just risked getting a little too radical.
Don't we all? I have one final question for you, and I think it kind of wraps up this entire event nicely. The focus on making sure people it's free, safe, and healthy, correct? Is that right? Okay. In an ideal world where, there is no more pretrial detainees, there, we don't have to worry about this anymore. You talk about working yourself, your organization out of existence. And maybe you probably already have these parameters in place, but when someone has been arrested, they aren't going to be a pretrial detainee. What's the next step? What can we do for them? Because I feel like that's still a very vulnerable place to be, knowing that you have to go to trial. You talked about not knowing your rights when you were arrested. Some people don't know what to expect, when they know that they need to get to trial. So once you've either gotten someone out of jail, what next steps do you offer them or help them with? And in an ideal world where there is no detainee process pre-trial, what can we implement to make sure that those people still have support?
So that's a great question. And there's a lot there too. I should have been more clear, and we'll take this opportunity to do so, that when we post bond at the Freedom Fund, or even when we don't, just y'all should know that your neighbors, most folks, and I mean most in the literal sense, more than 50% of people just get back to court on their own without any intervention, without any support, no matter what they're charged with, from the lowest level offense to the highest level offense. People tend to go to court. Most of you would, if you remembered, right? If you knew you had court. But for the folks who don't, and I'll say that one of the screening questions, I don't love that phrasing, but one of the things we ask and determine if we can help a person is we ask, what do they need to get back to court? The people, y'all will understand this, someone who needs $100 to get back to court has all the barriers to getting back to court. Transportation, housing. It's very humbling when I hear judges give this lecture about how disrespectful it is that someone has missed court. Some of our judges, not all, but some of our judges cannot fathom that a court date is not necessarily the most important thing in a person's life. And so the Freedom Fund, we certainly will help with transportation. We help with reminders. And that was a perfect tee up to, I've mentioned this sort of trifecta of legislation, litigation, and direct action. The Freedom Fund is supporting 2 bills this session in the Colorado legislature. One is SB 18. 18, it's a low number. So it was introduced early in the session. And it's a bill that is bipartisan. It is co-sponsored by a former sheriff who is a Republican. Good policy need not be partisan. Sometimes it is. And this bill is all about text reminders. You are either students or are proximal to students, and you recognize that good policy is grounded in good data, right? Data-driven, empirically sourced, evidence-based policies. And what do we know from years of data? The thing that gets people back to court, I already told the answer, but more than the thing that most people get back on their own, right? But in closing the gap from the people who don't get back on their own, and then what makes them get back, more than anything else, it's not an ankle monitor. It's certainly not the threat of money. It's not a fine. It's not a fee. It's not the threat of rearrest. The thing that gets people back to court is what, y'all? That's it. I mean, and it's so beautiful. Like, who can actually oppose it? Let me not jinx it. I think we'll pass unanimously. But we passed a bill before about text reminders, and it was opt-in. And I have some autonomy and agency are very important to me. So when we passed the bill a couple of years ago, opt-in seemed like the thing, and we realized no one opts in. But like the state knows your number anyway, knows where you are anyway. So the whole point of the bill is to make it opt out. So unless you tell the judge, I don't want a text reminder, and if you do, we respect that, you're going to get one. And a lot of our neighbors, even who don't have consistent landlines, they have, what's it called? Text Now, right? They have WhatsApp, they have a way to be texted. So what we care about doing is giving them the opportunity to get back. We're also working really hard on legislation that's going to make it not a new crime as it is right now to miss a court date. That is a problem. I want you to get your case done to get the monkey off your back so you can move on and not be looking over your shoulder. But if you happen to miss a court date, and particularly in the case of some of our folks who are really struggling with really difficult socioeconomic circumstances, if months have passed and they've missed a court date and they've managed to not get a new arrest, I think that is really impressive. We shouldn't make it then a new arrest because they missed the court date, the failure to appear. So the answer is we offer them the support in terms of rides, in terms of reminders, both ourselves, but also changing the law to have the state invest in that resource. That's good public policy, right? If every voter can get a ballot, right, everyone can get a reminder of their court date. So we're really interested in interventions that respect people's autonomy and agency. We are not bail bondsmen. We do not chase you down. We don't want to be another burden to someone. We hope you get back to court, and but the level of intervention that we do really stops with that support.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for being here.
Thank y'all so much.